The night was quiet, almost deceptively so, the kind of silence that usually belongs to victory rather than loss. Somewhere far from the roar of premieres and flashing cameras, Tom Cruise sat with a life that looked complete from the outside and unbearably fragile from within. 3 marriages lay behind him, each once framed as a fairy tale, each now reduced to a memory that refused to settle. The distance from his children, spoken about only in fragments and avoided questions, had become louder than any applause he ever received on a red carpet. For decades, the world watched him run, fight, fly, and survive impossible odds on screen. Yet away from the lights, exhaustion crept in slowly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet, persistent weight that fame could never lift. Hollywood had trained audiences to see him as unbreakable. His characters never hesitated, never doubted, never failed for long. But real life was not edited for momentum. It stretched time, repeated mistakes, and forced him to confront emotions he could not outrun. Romantic turmoil followed him like a shadow, not always visible, but always present. Each relationship drew attention not because of scandal alone, but because people sensed something unresolved beneath the surface, a longing that success could not satisfy. For years, Tom Cruise refused to speak openly about love. Interviews stayed focused on films, discipline, preparation, and the next challenge. Personal questions were deflected with charm or silence. That silence became part of the story. It suggested that whatever had gone wrong was too complex, too personal, or too painful to explain in neat sentences. Fans speculated endlessly. Who was the one who truly mattered? Who shaped him before the fame hardened his edges? Who remained in his thoughts when the cameras were gone? The intrigue grew because his life offered too many contrasts. On one hand, global dominance, box office records, and an image built on control and precision. On the other, a private history marked by emotional strain, separations, and an ongoing search for stability. Love, for him, never appeared simple. It arrived with intensity, promise, and hope, only to dissolve under pressure, leaving behind questions rather than closure. What made the story compelling was not scandal, but repetition. Each chapter seemed to echo the one before it, as if he were circling the same emotional ground, hoping for a different outcome. Observers noticed the pattern long before he ever acknowledged it. He loved deeply, committed fiercely, and expected completeness, yet the very force of that desire often accelerated the unraveling. The stronger the need for certainty, the more fragile the bond became. Behind the public image, there were moments that never reached headlines. Long flights alone, hotel rooms emptied of conversation, phone calls that ended too quickly, the slow realization that achievement did not equal connection. These were not scenes of dramatic failure, but of quiet recognition. The kind that arrives late at night, when there is nothing left to perform. When the idea surfaced that Tom Cruise had finally revealed who truly mattered most to him, it carried weight precisely because he had resisted such declarations for so long. The notion of a confession suggested surrender, a moment where control loosened and honesty took its place. It hinted that after decades of deflection, something had shifted. Not a press statement, not a grand interview, but a subtle acknowledgement woven through actions, absences, and priorities. The question was never simply about romance. It was about identity. Who was Tom Cruise when stripped of roles, discipline, and expectation? What did love mean to someone whose life was defined by motion and mastery? And what remained when the noise faded? His journey through relationships was not just a series of personal choices, but a reflection of an internal struggle between the desire to belong and the instinct to maintain control. As the years passed, the stakes grew higher. Love was no longer youthful discovery, but a test of whether stability was still possible. Each attempt carried more history, more pressure, and less margin for error. The public watched, often without empathy, mistaking visibility for understanding. Yet beneath the spectacle was a man confronting the same questions as anyone else, only without the privacy to answer them quietly. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a wedding or a divorce, not with applause or controversy, but with a man standing at the intersection of power and vulnerability. The realization that conquering the world did not guarantee peace, and that the most enduring relationships are often the ones defined by absence, silence, and longing rather than presence. The love of his life, whatever form it ultimately took, was shaped by decades of searching, losing, and learning what could not be forced. Before the world learned to associate his name with certainty and control, Tom Cruise grew up in motion, both physical and emotional. His childhood was marked by constant relocation, fractured stability, and an atmosphere where safety never fully settled. Schools changed, friendships dissolved before they could deepen, and home never felt permanent. His father was often described as unpredictable and harsh, a presence that instilled fear rather than reassurance. His mother, by contrast, represented endurance and quiet resilience, holding the family together through transitions that left lasting impressions on a young boy still learning what it meant to belong. In those early years, affection felt conditional, something that could vanish without warning. That absence would later define how he loved, how intensely he attached, and how desperately he tried to preserve emotional bonds once they formed. Academically, he struggled. Reading came slowly, attention wandered, and discipline arrived not as guidance, but as pressure. What saved him was movement. Sports, physical exertion, and later performance gave him a language he could control. Acting became more than ambition. It became refuge. On stage and in front of a camera, he could rehearse certainty, repeat success, and correct mistakes through effort. The structure of performance offered something life never had, rules that rewarded discipline and commitment. That sense of order would follow him into adulthood, shaping both his career and his expectations of intimacy. When he arrived in Hollywood, he carried little more than confidence and hunger. Early success came fast, faster than emotional maturity could keep pace. Fame rewarded his intensity, his relentless drive, his refusal to settle for average. Each role reinforced the idea that effort could overcome instability. Yet the very traits that made him extraordinary on screen complicated his personal life. He loved with the same force he worked, all in, uncompromising, convinced that devotion alone could secure permanence. As recognition grew, so did the contradiction. The public saw a young star ascending with ease, while privately he remained vigilant, scanning for signs of abandonment. Relationships became places where he sought what childhood denied him: reassurance, loyalty, and continuity. But expectations were high, sometimes impossibly so. Partners were not only lovers, but emotional anchors, expected to steady a man whose life moved at accelerating speed. His early romances reflected this imbalance. He was earnest, attentive, and deeply present, but also searching, leaning, and at times unknowingly demanding. He wanted closeness that could withstand distance, patience that could survive pressure, and understanding that required little explanation. These needs were rarely spoken aloud, yet they shaped every interaction. When affection faltered or priorities diverged, he internalized the loss as confirmation of a familiar truth, that stability was fragile and temporary. Marriage seemed, at first, like the answer. Commitment offered structure, a defined space where love could be protected from uncertainty. With Mimi Rogers, he found guidance as much as companionship. She was older, experienced, and grounded, qualities that appealed to someone still seeking orientation. Their relationship introduced him to new frameworks for meaning and self-control, including spiritual ideas that promise clarity and purpose. For a time, marriage gave him what he believed he lacked: direction, partnership, and the promise of permanence. Yet even then, tension simmered beneath the surface. His internal restlessness did not disappear. It merely changed form. As his career soared, the gap between professional dominance and personal vulnerability widened. With Nicole Kidman, the narrative appeared different. Two rising stars, equally ambitious, equally admired, building a life together under relentless scrutiny. Their bond seemed to offer balance. They shared demanding schedules, creative passion, and a desire to build something lasting. Adoption deepened that sense of family, turning abstract longing into tangible responsibility. For a moment, it appeared that he had outrun the patterns of his past. But time revealed old tensions resurfacing. Control, once a survival mechanism, became a point of friction. Beliefs diverged. Boundaries blurred. The same intensity that fueled his devotion also narrowed his flexibility. Love required adaptation, compromise, and space for difference, qualities that conflicted with his instinct to manage and secure. The dissolution of that marriage did not simply end a relationship. It fractured a vision he had invested in deeply, the image of a family that would finally endure. Afterward, each subsequent connection carried the weight of what had failed before. With Penelope Cruz, there was warmth and shared creativity, yet also the lingering shadow of unfinished grief. With Katie Holmes, the promise of renewal appeared brighter, youth, optimism, and the birth of a daughter that embodied everything he hoped family could be. For a brief time, the world watched him soften. Public enthusiasm, though excessive, reflected a genuine belief that he had found what he had been seeking all along. Yet even this chapter could not escape underlying contradictions. Power imbalances, external influence, and the strain of constant attention eroded intimacy. When that marriage ended abruptly, it left behind not only another loss, but a deeper reckoning. He had achieved everything he set out to conquer professionally, yet personal stability remained elusive. The irony was inescapable. Discipline had mastered the external world, but failed to resolve the internal one. Through all these years, the core remained unchanged. A boy shaped by impermanence became a man obsessed with continuity. Success amplified his reach, but not his peace. Love, when it arrived, carried the promise of healing, but also the risk of reopening old wounds. Understanding his story requires seeing beyond headlines and roles, toward a lifelong effort to reconcile control with vulnerability, ambition with intimacy. That tension did not define a single relationship. It defined the man himself. The turning point did not arrive as a single explosive scandal, but as a slow accumulation of pressure that finally forced everything beneath the surface. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Tom Cruise was no longer just a movie star. He was a system. Studios adjusted schedules around him. Entire marketing campaigns were built on his presence, and expectations followed him into every private room he entered. The very discipline that had once protected him now magnified the cost of every personal decision. Love was no longer a refuge from work. It was entangled with it, scrutinized, negotiated, and inevitably tested. The marriage with Nicole Kidman reached its most fragile stage during a period that demanded emotional exposure rather than control. Filming Eyes Wide Shut required months of isolation, repetition, and psychological intensity. Days blurred into nights, and the boundary between performance and real emotion weakened. Friends later recalled how the process stripped away comfort, leaving both partners raw and exhausted. What appeared to the public as artistic dedication quietly accelerated emotional distance. The film ended, but the strain did not. When the marriage collapsed soon after, the explanation offered to the world sounded practical and restrained. Yet those close to the situation sensed something deeper had broken. It was not just a relationship that ended, but the belief that shared ambition alone could protect intimacy. The aftermath carried a silence heavier than the breakup itself. For the first time, Tom faced the reality that the family he had worked so carefully to build could dissolve despite effort, loyalty, and sacrifice. Adoption had once symbolized permanence. Losing the marriage reactivated the same childhood fear he had spent decades outrunning, that bonds could vanish without warning. The pain did not erupt publicly. It settled inward, reshaping how he approached everything that followed. When he met Penelope Cruz, the timing itself revealed the emotional terrain he was navigating. The relationship grew out of collaboration, not pursuit. It offered warmth, shared creativity, and a sense of calm absent from his recent life. Yet the wounds from the past were still open. Those who observed him during that period described a man torn between hope and caution, eager for connection, yet wary of committing to another vision that might fracture. The relationship unfolded under relentless media pressure, with every gesture interpreted as recovery or rebound. Over time, the quiet strain of being constantly watched eroded the space necessary for healing. Their separation came without public drama, but it left behind a familiar ache. Once again, love had arrived gently and departed quietly, reinforcing the sense that stability remained just beyond reach. What followed was not retreat, but escalation. The relationship with Katie Holmes marked a shift in tone, scale, and consequence. From the beginning, it unfolded in full view of the public, transforming personal affection into spectacle. The intensity was unmistakable. Declarations were grand, gestures unrestrained, and emotion unfiltered. For a man long associated with control, this openness seemed almost defiant. Some saw it as liberation, others as overcorrection. Inside that whirlwind was a deeper truth. He was not simply in love. He was trying to reclaim something he believed he had lost forever, the possibility of a complete, enduring family. The birth of their daughter, Suri Cruz, altered the emotional equation entirely. Fatherhood anchored him in a way nothing else had. Those close to him described a softness rarely seen before, a deliberate slowing of pace, a protective instinct that eclipsed professional ambition. For a brief moment, the longing that had shaped his adult life seemed fulfilled. The image was powerful and convincing. A global icon had finally found the home he had been searching for since childhood. Yet beneath that image, fractures were forming. Differences in belief systems, influence, and authority began to surface. The presence of the Church of Scientology, long intertwined with his personal framework, became a source of tension rather than guidance. What he experienced as structure and certainty felt to others like intrusion and control. Decisions once made privately were now filtered through expectations that extended beyond the marriage itself. The emotional space between husband and wife narrowed as external pressures intensified. The separation arrived swiftly and decisively, shocking not because it was loud, but because it was final. In a matter of weeks, the life he had publicly embraced dissolved. Custody arrangements were settled. Futures were redrawn. The efficiency of the process contrasted painfully with the emotional wreckage left behind. Those close to him spoke of disbelief, not anger. The speed of the loss echoed earlier experiences, reinforcing a pattern he could neither deny nor escape. What made this rupture uniquely devastating was not only the end of a marriage, but the disruption of fatherhood. Access became limited. Presence turned conditional. The connection he valued most was suddenly mediated by distance and silence. For someone whose greatest fear was impermanence, the situation cut deeply. No role, no discipline, no achievement offered leverage here. The usual tools failed. Control was no longer an option. In the years that followed, he retreated from public discussion of his private life. Interviews focused on work. Questions about family were deflected or left unanswered. The absence spoke louder than any statement. Those who observed him during this period noted a return to relentless productivity, as if motion itself had become a shield. Projects multiplied. Physical demands increased. The man known for defying limits appeared once again determined to outrun emotional gravity. Yet even relentless motion could not erase the quiet truth. The central tragedy was no longer about romantic failure, but about consequence. Every decision made in pursuit of certainty had carried unintended costs. Every attempt to secure permanence had intensified vulnerability. Love, when forced to exist under control and expectation, resisted and eventually withdrew. This phase of his life revealed the full weight of the conflict that had defined him since childhood. The need to belong collided with the need to manage. Vulnerability competed with authority. The result was not collapse, but endurance without resolution. He continued forward, admired, accomplished, and respected, yet carrying a private reckoning that no role could resolve. The biographical arc often celebrated his resilience. What remained less visible was the quiet grief that accompanied survival. Success did not erase loss. Discipline did not guarantee peace. And love, when entangled with fear, power, and exposure, became both salvation and wound. This was the moment when the past and present fully converged, leaving him to confront not what he had achieved, but what he could not hold on to. The consequences did not announce themselves loudly. They unfolded gradually, shaping days and years rather than headlines. After the public endings and private fractures, Tom Cruise entered a phase where loss no longer felt temporary. It became structural. The kind of absence that does not heal with time, but instead rearranges priorities, habits, and emotional boundaries. The man who once believed discipline could master any challenge now confronted limits that effort could not cross. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Those close to him observed a narrowing of emotional range in public settings, a return to precision and professionalism that left little room for spontaneity. He remained courteous, focused, and driven, yet something essential had retreated inward. Conversations avoided depth. Laughter appeared measured. Vulnerability, once briefly visible, was carefully sealed away again. The cost of openness had proven too high. Fatherhood, once the anchor he believed would stabilize everything, became the most painful reminder of what had slipped beyond his control. The relationship with his daughter was no longer defined by everyday presence, but by distance and silence. For a man whose deepest motivation had always been to build the family he never had, this separation cut through every layer of achievement. Friends described moments when professional success seemed to lose its usual effect. Applause no longer restored equilibrium. Awards no longer compensated for what was missing. The emotional toll extended beyond personal grief. It reshaped how he interacted with the world. Trust became selective. Relationships, both romantic and platonic, were approached with caution. The intensity that once fueled connection was redirected into work. Physical preparation grew even more extreme. Projects demanded greater endurance, greater risk, greater control. It was as if pushing the body to its limits offered temporary relief from what the heart could not resolve. Socially, the consequences were complex. Public perception oscillated between admiration and speculation. Some viewed his privacy as strength. Others interpreted it as detachment. The truth lived somewhere quieter. Withdrawal was not arrogance, but self-preservation. He had learned that exposure invited interpretation, and interpretation often stripped nuance away. Silence, though lonely, offered safety. Within the industry, his reputation remained formidable. Studios trusted him. Collaborators respected his discipline. Yet there was a subtle shift. The man once celebrated for openness and enthusiasm became known for boundaries. Meetings were efficient. Interactions were purposeful. The warmth that once drew people and was still present, but guarded, carefully rationed. Those who earned his trust did so slowly. The broader consequence lay in identity. For decades, his sense of self had been built on momentum, progress, and forward motion. When personal life refused to align with that trajectory, it forced a reckoning. He could no longer define success solely by accumulation. Achievements stacked higher than ever, yet satisfaction proved elusive. The imbalance was not visible on screen, but it shaped choices behind it. Emotionally, grief did not manifest as despair, but as endurance. He did not collapse. He adapted. That adaptation, however, carried its own cost. Constant self-regulation left little room for rest. The mind remained alert, vigilant against disappointment. Love, once pursued with urgency, became something approached from a distance. Desire remained, but expectation diminished. The influence of belief systems that once offered clarity now revealed unintended consequences. What had initially provided structure and certainty became intertwined with decisions that narrowed emotional flexibility. Critics framed this as control. Supporters described it as conviction. From the inside, it functioned as armor. Armor protects, but it also isolates. Over time, the line between safety and confinement blurred. The long-term losses were not limited to relationships. Opportunities for ordinary moments vanished. School events unattended. Conversations delayed. Traditions never formed. These were not dramatic sacrifices, but cumulative ones. Each absence added weight to the realization that time, once lost, could not be reclaimed. No schedule adjustment or career pause could restore moments that had passed. Public reactions mirrored this complexity. Media narratives simplified what was deeply layered. He was portrayed either as victim or architect of his own isolation. Neither fully captured the reality. The truth lay in the collision between personal longing and systemic pressure, between individual choice and institutional influence. Fame magnified every misalignment, leaving little room for quiet correction. What remained was a man still moving forward, but differently. The energy that once chased connection now sustained survival. The ambition that once promised wholeness now maintained stability. He continued to perform extraordinary feats, not because they defined him, but because they gave shape to days otherwise marked by absence. The impact of these years did not resolve neatly. There was no cathartic transformation, no public redemption arc. Instead, there was continuity, a life adjusted around loss rather than healed from it. The consequences became part of his internal landscape, influencing how he loved, how he trusted, and how he imagined the future. In the end, the deepest effect was not the loss itself, but the acceptance that some fractures do not close. They simply become quieter. They inform choices without announcing themselves. For Tom Cruise, the aftermath was not about defeat, but about learning to exist with unresolved longing, carrying it alongside success, and continuing forward without the illusion that control alone could deliver peace. There were moments that never reached headlines, moments that existed only in passing comments, half-remembered anecdotes, and the quiet recollections of those who crossed his path away from cameras. These stories did not contradict the public narrative. They deepened it. They revealed a man whose inner life was shaped less by spectacle than by small, human gestures that carried disproportionate emotional weight. In private settings, Tom Cruise was often described as intensely attentive. When he listened fully, leaning forward, eyes fixed, absorbing every detail. Friends noted that this focus was not performative. It was a habit formed early, a way of ensuring connection did not slip away unnoticed. He remembered birthdays, small preferences, fleeting worries shared in confidence. Yet this attentiveness carried an unspoken tension. It came with the fear that if attention wavered, loss would follow. Former collaborators recalled evenings after long shoots when the energy finally slowed. While others relaxed into casual conversation, he often retreated into silence. Not detachment, but reflection. He would sit apart, hands folded, replaying the day in his mind. One colleague described it as watching someone carry an invisible checklist, not of tasks completed, but of emotional exchanges. Who seemed distant? Who smiled differently? Who might be pulling away? These moments revealed a vigilance rooted not in ego, but in insecurity. There were also stories of generosity that never became public campaigns. Quiet financial support, personal calls made at unexpected hours, apologies delivered face to face rather than through intermediaries. In these actions, those close to him recognized sincerity rather than strategy. He did not give to be seen. He gave to repair, to maintain connection, to keep relationships intact in whatever form remained possible. The most telling moments surfaced in how he handled silence. When communication faltered, he did not fill the gap with noise. Instead, he waited. That waiting often stretched longer than necessary, driven by the hope that space might invite return. It was a pattern visible across his personal history. When relationships ended, he rarely retaliated or explained himself publicly. He withdrew, allowing narratives to form without correction. Silence became both shield and sentence. People who worked with him during periods of personal strain noticed subtle shifts. He arrived earlier than required. He stayed later than necessary. Physical training intensified. Precision increased. These were not signs of obsession, but of grounding. Routine offered stability when emotional life felt uncertain. In repetition, he found predictability. In exertion, temporary release. One assistant once shared that during particularly difficult periods, he avoided personal music playlists. Instead, he listened to instrumental scores or silence during long drives. Lyrics, the assistant explained, made him reflective. Reflection risked opening doors he preferred to keep closed. Music without words allowed motion without memory. The stories surrounding fatherhood were the most delicate. Those who glimpsed him in quieter family moments spoke of gentleness that contrasted sharply with his public intensity. He lowered his voice instinctively. His movements softened. He listened without interruption. These were not learned behaviors. They appeared intuitive, as if he were trying to give what he himself had once lacked. When access became limited, the adjustment was not dramatic. It was internal. The absence manifested not in anger, but in restraint. He stopped speaking about certain things altogether. There were attempts to rebuild privately, not necessarily through romance, but through companionship. Dinners kept small, circles narrowed, trust extended cautiously. He learned to value consistency over intensity, presence over promise. Those relationships did not generate headlines, but they sustained him in ways the public never saw. A recurring theme in these quiet accounts was effort without expectation. He no longer pursued connection as something to be secured permanently. Instead, he treated it as something to be honored while present. This shift did not erase longing, but it softened its grip. It allowed him to experience closeness without immediately measuring its durability. Several colleagues remarked on how differently he spoke about time in later years. Earlier, he treated it as something to be optimized, scheduled, conquered. Later, he spoke of it as something to respect. Delays no longer frustrated him. Interruptions were accepted. This subtle change suggested an internal recalibration, a recognition that control over outcomes did not guarantee meaning. Even his approach to fame shifted quietly. Public appearances became deliberate rather than frequent. Engagements were chosen carefully. He no longer sought to correct misconceptions. He allowed distance to grow between persona and self, understanding that constant clarification drained emotional resources. Privacy became less about secrecy and more about sustainability. These silent stories did not present redemption or resolution. They revealed adaptation. A man learning to live with unanswered questions rather than chasing definitive closure. He did not abandon the desire for connection. He reframed it. Love was no longer a destination to reach, but an experience to navigate without illusion. In these unspoken chapters, the tragedy was not the absence of happiness, but the acceptance that happiness might arrive in fragments rather than as a complete structure. He learned to recognize meaning in brief exchanges and shared understanding that did not demand permanence. The quiet courage lay in continuing to engage, knowing that loss was always possible. These were the moments that rarely made it into profiles or documentaries. They were too subtle, too human, too unresolved. Yet they carried the emotional truth of his journey more accurately than any headline ever could. They showed a man who did not escape his past, but learned to move alongside it, carrying its weight without letting it define every step. Over time, the meaning of Tom Cruise's life began to shift from achievement to endurance. The legacy he was building was no longer defined solely by box office numbers, physical feats, or cinematic dominance. Those accomplishments remained undeniable, but they no longer told the full story. Beneath them ran a quieter current shaped by loss, adaptation, and an ongoing effort to reconcile power with vulnerability. His journey suggested that success, when stripped of illusion, does not resolve inner conflict. It only gives it a larger stage. What emerged was a paradox. He mastered precision, discipline, and control in nearly every external domain, yet the most intimate aspects of life resisted those same tools. This contradiction became the central lesson of his story. It revealed that strength, when overextended, can harden into rigidity, and that resilience without reflection can quietly exhaust the spirit. The man celebrated for defying gravity learned that some forces cannot be outmaneuvered. The legacy he carried was not one of failure, but of complexity. He demonstrated how ambition can elevate a person while simultaneously narrowing emotional range. His life illustrated that relentless forward motion, though admired, often leaves little space for repair. In this sense, his story became less about personal tragedy and more about the cost of sustained intensity. The question was never whether he could endure hardship. It was whether endurance alone was enough. There was also a deeper inheritance embedded in his choices. By continuing to work, to train, to push physical boundaries well beyond conventional limits, he left behind a model of commitment that inspired admiration across generations. Yet alongside that inspiration was a quieter caution. Dedication without balance demands payment later, often in forms that cannot be negotiated or postponed. His life suggested that legacy is shaped as much by what one protects as by what one achieves. In reflecting on family, the meaning of legacy grew even more nuanced. The absence of ordinary continuity did not erase the presence of care. Instead, it reframed it. Love did not disappear. It transformed into responsibility carried privately rather than displayed publicly. The inability to preserve a traditional structure did not negate the intention behind it. In this way, his story challenged simplistic definitions of success in personal life. It asked whether legacy is measured by permanence or by sincerity. Spiritually and philosophically, his path revealed the risks of seeking certainty in systems rather than in human connection. Belief frameworks provided order and reassurance, yet when they hardened into doctrine, they narrowed emotional flexibility. The lesson here was not about belief itself, but about proportion. When ideology replaces dialogue, relationships strain. When certainty overrides empathy, intimacy recedes. His life demonstrated how easily meaning can become control if not tempered by doubt. Publicly, his legacy remained heroic. Privately, it was human. This duality became its own inheritance. Future observers would see not just an action star who refused to age conventionally, but a man who continued moving forward while carrying unresolved longing. That unresolved quality gave his story weight. It resisted neat conclusions. It reminded audiences that fulfillment is not guaranteed by excellence, and that even the most admired figures remain subject to the same emotional laws as everyone else. The enduring lesson lay in acceptance. Not resignation, but recognition. Recognition that some fractures become part of identity rather than problems to be solved. Recognition that meaning does not always arrive as closure. Sometimes it arrives as understanding. His life suggested that wisdom is less about conquering desire and more about learning how to live beside it without letting it dictate every choice. As years passed, the urgency that once defined his pursuit of love softened into reflection. This did not signal defeat. It signaled maturity shaped by experience rather than idealism. He learned that legacy is not only what remains visible, but what is carried forward internally. The discipline that once chased certainty evolved into a steadier presence. The ambition that once demanded resolution learned to coexist with ambiguity. In this sense, his legacy became quietly instructive. It offered a mirror to anyone who believes that control guarantees peace or that achievement compensates for absence. His life suggested otherwise. It proposed that peace requires a willingness to accept limits, to allow vulnerability without immediately correcting it, and to value connection without insisting on permanence. Ultimately, the story he leaves behind is not one of triumph or tragedy alone. It is the story of a man navigating the tension between light and shadow, between mastery and longing. The legacy is not a finished monument, but an ongoing question. How does one remain open after loss? How does one honor love without possession? How does one continue forward without pretending that forward is always better? Those questions linger, unresolved but meaningful. And in their persistence, they form the most honest inheritance of all. As the story draws to a close, what remains is not a definitive answer, but a lingering silence filled with meaning. Tom Cruise's journey does not conclude with resolution or redemption in the traditional sense. It settles instead into something more honest and more difficult to accept. A life lived at extraordinary speed eventually confronts the limits of momentum. Not everything broken can be repaired, and not every longing can be fulfilled in the way it was once imagined. Looking back, the arc of his personal life resembles a series of near arrivals. Moments when happiness felt close enough to touch, when stability seemed within reach, only to recede just as belief began to form. Each chapter carried promise, intensity, and hope, followed by separation and quiet withdrawal. What makes this story resonate is not scandal or fame, but recognition. The recognition that even those who appear invincible struggle with the same fundamental human questions. How to belong. How to be loved without losing oneself. How to protect what matters without trying to control it. The tragedy is subtle rather than dramatic. It lives in missed mornings, unanswered questions, and futures imagined but never lived. It exists in the contrast between global admiration and private absence. For decades, audiences watched him outrun danger on screen, yet the most difficult pursuits were internal and invisible. No stunt could prepare him for the reality that love resists force, and that family cannot be secured through will alone. Yet there is also dignity in what remains. Endurance itself becomes a form of courage. He did not retreat into bitterness or denial. He continued forward, carrying loss alongside purpose. That persistence, though quiet, speaks volumes. It reflects a man who understands that life does not always offer completion, only continuation. And continuation, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It is resolve. The legacy of this journey is not confined to one relationship or one outcome. It is carried in the way he learned to move differently through the world. Less declarative, more contained, less certain, more aware. The urgency that once demanded answers softened into patience. The need to define love transformed into the willingness to experience it without guarantees. This evolution, though rarely acknowledged publicly, marks the most profound shift of all. In the end, the idea of true love changes shape. It is no longer defined by permanence or possession, but by meaning, by what remains after separation, by the imprint left on identity rather than the structure built around it. The love that matters most may not be the one that lasts forever, but the one that reshapes how a person understands connection, responsibility, and self. Tom Cruise's story leaves us with a question rather than a conclusion. Can a life be considered whole even when certain desires remain unfulfilled? Can purpose coexist with unresolved longing? His journey suggests that it can. That wholeness does not require perfection, only honesty. That strength does not demand certainty, only the courage to keep moving with awareness. For those watching from the outside, it is easy to reduce such a life to headlines or symbols. The action star, the icon, the enigma. But beneath those labels lies a human narrative shaped by the same forces that define everyone else. Love gained, love lost, hope renewed, hope tested. The difference lies only in scale, not substance. As the final image fades, what stays with us is not spectacle, but reflection. A reminder that success cannot replace connection, and that control cannot substitute for trust. That even the most disciplined lives must eventually make room for vulnerability. And that sometimes the deepest stories are not those that end neatly, but those that continue quietly, shaped by lessons learned rather than victories claimed. Now the story rests with you. After witnessing this journey of ambition, loss, endurance, and unresolved longing, what do you believe defines true fulfillment? Is it stability, connection, freedom, or something more fragile and personal? Do you think complete family happiness is ever attainable under the weight of fame and expectation, or does meaning emerge in other, less visible ways? Share your thoughts and comments. If this story resonated with you, consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing for more reflections on the hidden lives behind familiar faces. The next story is already waiting, and with it, another chance to look beyond the surface and into the quiet truths that shape us all.